this all comes together. Certainly, I actually came to Oracle from the acquisition of BEA, as did Jim Calise. So we've been around this space and these products for quite a while. But what I'd like to talk about today is essentially the barriers that we see to BPM. As Greg mentioned, basically we'll have the two presentations. The second piece is to really show you hands-on the tools and to understand what we're working with in terms of today's capabilities. The third piece is basically all about best practices and customer examples to help you understand how BPM has been used by other companies and what their success has been, right? Because I think that helps explain a lot of basically good opportunities that you should pursue with this technology. So, breaking through barriers. A little bit about the disclaimer in terms of product directions. I don't think we'll really get much into futures, but just a few notes if you're talking contracts with Oracle. So let's talk about, to begin, the technology, right? Both sort of where things have, evolved to, as well as the barriers. One of the things that's interesting when you think about managing processes is that no matter when, in history, in time, people have looked to improve processes, they've always looked to basically take advantage of whatever the latest technology is. People ask me today, well, what about cloud? Can BPM really handle cloud? Sure. It's just another technology, essentially, that has more to give to make it more efficient, streamlined, et cetera, et cetera. But let's reverse here quite a bit. If you think of basically process management and what Henry Ford was able to do with the Model T. Up to that point, cars were very expensive, and only a few people, per capita could really afford them. Yet he was able to streamline the process of assembly. Right, and the rest is history. The market expanded because of it. He was able to sell a lot more cars at a low price point, et cetera, et cetera. But what was the technology that inspired him? Well, interestingly enough, it was the meat hook, the meat conveyor, right? Basically, when you're, in a meat processing plant, the carcasses are on hooks and they go down sort of an assembly line. And it was that sort of thing that he saw that was the inspiration for how he could do this with cars. Oh, am I fading in and out? Okay. So, whether the technology is mechanical, computer, software, what have you, BPM has a long history of using that, as an advantage, right, in the management of processes. Apple certainly is another interesting case when you think about, desktop publishing. Right now, we don't even print documents out, but there was a point in the 80s where if you wanted to print something out, you had to go to a printer, right? Yet when Apple basically brought together software, hardware, a laser printer, the big innovation, it transformed basically that process, if you will, the process of publishing. Okay, well, the technology is often sort of a stimulant, if you will, to new capabilities, certainly. When you look at where BPM comes from, it's interesting in that it actually has its roots in two core technologies. Right? One being EAI, or Enterprise Application Integration, that you see represented on the left here, and then on the right, workflow. And as a result, it's most interesting in that this has its roots in mature technology, rather than something completely new like social networking, for example. And through various events, basically, over the years, things like, Y2K and document management and, the rest of these things, the concept of a business process management platform emerged. Right? And with the idea that it could address numbers of different types of processes, right? Yet, all this technology still has had its roots in, a specific type of process solution, whether it's document management, workflow, or system integration for that matter. And therein lies some of the challenges and some of the barriers and some of the problems. And the first one really, I think, has to do with process types. We naturally talk about processes as being system level processes, right, where you're getting information from one system, perhaps transposing it or doing some work on it and storing it in another system, right? Certainly BPL in its history was a technology that was very strong to be able to do that. But we also talk about workflow, right? We talk about human interaction as part of a process. And then there's things like document management, managing a document's creation and approval. And then the fourth sort of capability that we talk about is sort of decision-centric processes. You know, if you're going to merge with another company, everything that goes into that decision, right? Or if you're going to create a new product line, everything that goes into defining and specifying what that might be. And consequently, over the years, products evolved to address each of those four specific areas. And that's where certainly Fuego was, right, in 1999. It did a reasonably good job with system to system, and had its strength certainly with workflow and with the ability to model the processes by the business. But in reality, when you look at the processes that are key to organizations, they're not as discrete and isolated as separate system processes or separate, document processes or workflow for that matter. Quite often, as you see represented here, there's a piece of the whole process that, embodies that technology or that need. So right out of the gate, one of the barriers that we've been dealing with for quite a while is the fact that the tools to help automate processes are really designed to address perhaps one of these real well, right? When you really need something that can address all of them, sort of a measure of completeness. Good news is products have evolved to bring in these capabilities, right? But, it's always one of these things where the devil's in the details, right? How easy can you do that? So some of the barriers, certainly to success that you see that are independent really of technology in many ways. The people issue, right? Being able to deal with change management. Since process management is largely about change in people and organizations, right? Clearly communication is a big part of that, right? Communication and also collaboration, getting one on the same page, getting people to buy into the change, right, throughout the whole thing. Business buy-in, certainly, right? There's no sense managing or automating a process that the business doesn't feel is a problem, right? You're just not going to get any value out of that. Choosing the right process certainly can present barriers or enable your success, right? Depending on the complexity of the particular process, how many systems you need to integrate with, or also the impact that process can have. Governance, another issue, right? If you haven't designed managing the process for change in the future, then you're going to run into problems quite quickly because processes are certainly meant to change and they will change. And then there are limitations, basically, as I've mentioned, that have been traditionally tied to the tools that we're working with. Certainly the process completeness that I just mentioned is one of them. Now, what you see here on the left with the check boxes are the parts of these challenges that the tools can help you address. The only thing that the tools can help you address is choosing the right process, right? Back to this one. Okay. We're playing musical microphones today. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so, and basically the tools can help you with all of these, absent selecting the processes I've mentioned. Now, what about product barriers? Well, as we talked about, real-world processes don't fit cleanly into those four process types. And if tools are designed around one or two of those types, at some point you're going to need another tool, which means, additional training, additional maintenance, slower time to value, And the issue is then about integrating the two of them when you have processes that span both types, right? It's all about that multiple technologies, skills, and the impact that that has, right? Clearly, that also leads to a higher total cost of ownership, right? Because you have to maintain all of this. And I think also interestingly is how this plays into the type of projects that you can manage. Now, let me ask a question here. In your knowledge of process management to date, do you think BPM is ideal for A, strategic projects, or B, tactical projects? Which one is it better suited for? So let's say, by a show of hands here, strategic projects. Okay, that looks like about a third. How about tactical projects? Okay, well, about the same. Good, good. Well, it's kind of a trick question because it certainly is both at some level, but it depends on your ability to implement tactical projects with BPM. Because what's, the difference between tactical and strategic in terms of managing these processes? Tactical requires everything in terms of that you need for strategic processes, with the exception of also requiring fast time to deployment, right? By its nature, tactical is something that has to happen today, right? Now, one of the nice things about this too is that I think tactical provides, for the first time, because the tools have been more evolved, right, as of late. Tactical is much more approachable than it was, let's say, a generation of tools ago, right? And we often see, and you'll see in our examples that we'll talk about later, that there's a lot of ROI, there's a lot of payback, there's a lot of value to doing basically tactical projects. Okay, so these are the, some of the barriers that the product basically imposes, in addition to some of the barriers that we talked about that are just inherent in managing processes, right? And, essentially what this leads to is greater complexity than you need, less efficiency, and something that's slower and more costly to basically work with. Okay, so that's sort of where we've been. That's where technology has sort of, evolved to, in a sense. Where are we sort of today and tomorrow? What's really the requirements for process management that we see now, as well as moving to the future? Well, clearly, there's greater use of process management tools we're seeing in the enterprise. Not just departments, but the beginnings of enterprise-wide BPM. Right? Let me ask another question here. I'm curious as to the companies that you represent and their approach basically to technology. Right? You roll here because basically there's a demonstrated interest in BPM, right, which is great. But when you look at technology adoption, right, there's, if you recall, Jeffrey Moore had that wonderful bell curve, talked about the chasm, and there's a segment that are called the early adopters, right, people who really use technology for advantage, if you will, and they're willing to take technology even when it's not fully complete. And then, once you get across that chasm into more of a mainstream, the bigger part of the bell curve, you have more hesitant customers, what they call mainstream. So how many folks here would say that their use of BPM is around sort of the early adopter type of company? Okay, we got 1, 2, 3. Okay. And how about mainstream? Right. Okay. About 50-50, but then there's also a number of folks I think are on the fence. Okay. Well, just for your information, what I'm seeing is certainly a lot more today of mainstream sort of customers looking for BPM. And this makes sense because BPM has been around for about 10 years. There's been enough evolution where customers have basically used this to address lots of different problems. So there's less risk, right? There's the ability for a lot of incremental advantage and benefit. And that's what I mean here basically by the increased use by less tech-savvy enterprises, right? Also, what we're seeing is greater participation by the business, right? The desire. And the good news here is that, again, with the evolution of tools and technologies, this is now more possible, right? Certainly in those early days of Fuego in 1999 and 2000, business users were, a strong part of the user base because that tool was really designed around needs of business users. But there were other limitations that now have been addressed, okay? We're also seeing basically the need to use BPM in more tactical projects, right, for the reasons we talked about before. How many folks here have embraced SOA and are using SOA or plan to by the end of the year? Okay, I'd say maybe about 10%. Certainly BPM provides a mechanism to showcase SOA and to fully leverage the efforts that have gone into SOA, where you've got greater reusability in IT services, in connecting to different systems. Now you have the ability to basically build on top of that business flexibility. Okay. Also, we see folks looking to use BPM as part of packaged application, packaged application investments they've made. So manual or reducing manual processes that span multiple applications. And lastly, we're seeing basically interest in folks wanting to use BPM as sort of the glue or the synergy that's part of a larger, basically, synergistic business solution. Right? So it's not only connects with applications, not only maybe, connects using SOA, but then it takes advantage of more advanced processing sort of capabilities, right? Things like complex event processing that's designed to handle large numbers of events at a very high speed, right? And then being able to manage that as part of the processes or initiate action in the systems that basically measure that, right? So it's really BPM, I think, becoming itself more mainstream in the business of the enterprise, right? And that's a good thing. There's long been projected strong growth for business process management. And I think what we're seeing now is sort of the maturation of that growth in a different segment of the market, but in a way that certainly makes a lot of sense for the expanded growth and the continued use of this for business benefit. So this is what we're certainly hearing from customers. This is what we're seeing in the market. And these trends, if you will, certainly have implications of what's required, right? So, if you look essentially at the column on the right, what that really means is, well, the product's got to be less complex. Right? In order to do this type of work, you really need something that's, easier to use, easier to get going with, certainly something that can manage all process types, as we talked about before. So you see reduced complexity as really the implication on a number of these. You also see basically integration, unification, right, as part of this as well. So a more cohesive product that can work better together, right, out of the box. Back in the EAI days, right, when we've had multiple approaches to enterprise integration, there was a saying about having to integrate the integration tools before you start your integration, right? And unfortunately, that's something that's existed in business process management, quite honestly, for a while. And what we're looking at here is the need to basically fix that, finally, once and for all, okay? So these are sort of some of the product implications. Certainly, we talked a little bit here about working in conjunction with SOA and providing, additional benefit here in the area of business agility, right? Sort of layering on top of the IT reuse and agility that SOA provides. So certainly is an integral part of it. All right, let's talk a little here about the tactical and strategic that I mentioned before. All right, and to begin, what do we mean by strategic change? Right? Process management is all about managing change. Well, looking at major changes, right? Adoption of new products or new product directions, redeployment of resources, managing basically a company that's been acquired or a merger, right? As well as just adapting to different market dynamics. certainly, with what's happened in the economy the last few years, has required strategic change on the part of a lot of companies, right? And lastly, just the complete evolution of industries, right? As things have become more digital and we have obsolescence, I should say, in different areas, right? Like print media, music, CDs, video, and all the rest of that, as new channels of distribution emerge. So how does a company deal with it, right? It requires a strategic response. And sometimes that strategic response is basically designed for a transformation of the business, right? Totally changing basically how the business operates. Or maybe it's just about providing much more visibility into what's going on in the business and much more agility to be able to take advantage of that insight to make change, right? Either way, it's a strategic move. So what we see in terms of examples, and we'll look at some customer case studies on this, things basically companies where they transition to a process-centric view of the world, right, instead of a development-centric view, right? Companies that, have customers at the heart of what they do and look to transform to a customer-centric view of the world, right, to provide better service, greater loyalty, and all that kind of stuff. Perhaps it's a transformation that's really all about supporting a new area of revenue, right? Additional revenue growth. And then lastly, sometimes it's just looking at those mission critical processes that span multiple applications. It may be for a manufacturer going from design to production, right? It may be for a services company dealing with, essentially bringing customers on board in the whole process of customer life cycle. But this is what we mean by strategic change. And when you look at basically strategic processes, they are, as I just mentioned, the types of processes that span multiple applications. And this is sort of the traditional sweet spot for BPM, right? Looking at essentially the applications that exist in the enterprise, the core processes that bring in revenue require interaction with all these systems. Yet, the ownership of the enterprise is really divided in these vertical slices. Who owns CRM? Who owns sales and marketing? Who owns manufacturing, right? And it's being able to bridge those gaps and create greater efficiencies that has value, right? All right, what about tactical change? As we mentioned before, the big difference here is time critical, right? The need to do something quickly. And, everybody defines that differently. I did a panel how many folks here were at Open World last month? Anybody? Okay, yeah, we got one or two. I did a panel, basically a roundtable, which was sort of a discussion of customers and their, challenges and what they did to basically address them with BPM. And it was very interesting because I had a gentleman from the government, Department of Defense. I had another one from a services company who had been doing a lot of work with some very small, highly dynamic companies. And when we talked about time, the essence of what was fast, their answers were totally different, right? Fast for the government was like 6 months. Fast for, this integrator working with small companies was a matter of weeks, right? 2 weeks, 3 weeks. So whatever it is, right, there's this tactical need that needs to be addressed as soon as possible, generally because it's costing money, time, resources that just don't make sense. Okay, so the kinds of things you see, perhaps it's new regulation that needs to be complied with, right? Perhaps it's, simplifying an existing process or a part of that process, like order management, because there's redundancy in systems and you've got to manually enter things and it's error prone as a result, right? That's typically a place we see big wins quick for BPM, right? And then really streamlining any inefficient process, certainly. So when you look at, the tactical sort of use of BPM, well, it certainly may be just one of those particular application silos, right? And we had oops, what happened here? We had a customer that we worked with that did exactly this, right? Essentially, they're using, their HR systems, as most people do, but with the evolution of different rules, regulations, instead of managing them with custom code that's written in the tools for the application. They did this with BPM. Right? Why would they do that? Right? There's really lots of different approaches to being able to solve that need. Right? You can do it with the tools in the application. It tends to be, there's plenty of tools, capabilities to do it, but the negative is that when you go to when you go to upgrade, that can be problematic, right? I think we've all sort of seen the challenges of upgrading applications that have been highly customized over the last few years. Okay, you could do it with a separate application that you create, right? With code, with web services or what have you. And that's something else now that you got to maintain that's entirely separate, that has to go through normal development cycles in order to affect change. However, if you do it with BPM, right, now you've got basically a solution to this need that's done in an environment that's built for change, right? That's really what BPM is. It's an environment that's designed to manage change on a continuing basis, right? But just by the nature of being able to model, deploy, right, to simulate, to understand what's going on, it's just much more flexible than perhaps doing code and other approaches are. So this particular company basically did the compliance for the Fair Labor Standards Act using BPM, and the connection between the two is rather simple. It's a simple web service basically. At the right part of the process, it calls out, BPM does its thing, comes back in, status is updated, and there it goes. So that's one way to do tactical. Tactical certainly can involve multiple silos. It can involve lots of different things. But I encourage you to certainly take a look at that. Okay, so I think we talked a little bit about this. What's required here for the two? Well, really everything that's required for strategic is required for tactical with the addition of, fast time to value, right? Because of the, the gating circumstances. This also means, though, that, it needs to be integrated, right? It needs to be unified because you don't have time to integrate the integration tools before you start the integration. You don't have time to try to communicate with everybody in, different contexts that make it difficult for people to understand what's going on. Right? And communication and collaboration is an important area too, especially when you think about success with BPM. How many folks here have gone sort of the full gamut and managed processes with BPM? Okay, we got one, we got two, three, okay. Well, having done that the people part is a critical piece. And, the communication and collaboration is critical, right? Getting the executive buy-in that you need so that you have support from the top when you need it, keeping everyone on the same page, so that their expectations are practical, realistic. You just think about, this is an easy one if you think about the converse, right? If you have a miscommunication in the course of a BPM project, you can imagine what a disaster that might be because you're going to get some organization that says, nah, I don't want to be part of this, right? And that's a critical piece. Everybody's got to be part of it, right? Well, what's the most general way that we get notification of tasks and things like that are part of a process? Well, it tends to be the email inbox, right? Now, I don't think that there's a tool that is less context-aware of process than email, right? Email is a great tool, but every message is a different context. We try to create more context in email with folders, right? With rules, grouping things together. And it works to some extent, but it's still pretty, rough in terms of being able to have things that are tied to a particular process all in one place, right? So, here's where, when you talk about process management, I think it's important to have sort of collaboration and communication that is, a place you go that you can see everything about that process, right? So you don't lose that context, right? So that's something that also is very important to tactical because Again, you don't have the time. You don't have the luxury of time that a strategic project might have. Okay, so these implications again drive basically products requirements now, right? So if we sort of boil it all down, the things that are necessary here that we've seen are tools got to be made easier so you can collaborate and communicate. They've got to be easier to use so the business can be a viable partner in this. There's got to be tools for each and every role, not just business and IT, but the myriad sort of different roles that are within each one. Right? And the roles that are in your organization are probably somewhat different than those that are in someone else's organization. So they got to be customizable, right? Faster time to value. Clearly you need that for tactical, right? Reduce complexity overall, right? The ability to manage all process types, right? Lower cost to deploy, the integration with the larger world that you're working with, which is like applications, middleware, as well as other tools for advanced processing like we talked about earlier, like complex event processing or business intelligence for that matter. If you've got all this, you've got basically a full toolbox with what we like to talk about as being complete. Right? You've got capabilities that can not only address what you need today, but provide enough headroom to take you through tomorrow and where things may evolve further down the road. And if you have these capabilities that are integrated together, right? Well, now you also have capabilities that you can use because you don't have to waste a lot of time integrating them, right? So these are certainly the things that drive Oracle in what we've done. Here, just showing you basically the things on here that are really critical to tactical, which are the first four. And what we set out to do, I think there's a slide on it, but let me just talk about it from here. I'm having a tough time standing in one place, so forgive me as I shift around here. I'm used to being able to walk around. When you look at Oracle's history and evolution in process management, right? Oracle acquired Colaxa back in, I think it was 2004, which was a leading BPEL, right, business process execution language tool for system-to-system processes. And then it acquired BEA in 2008. And BEA had acquired Fuego in 2006. And Fuego was, as Greg mentioned, one of the early pioneers in BPM going back to 1998, 99, right? So we had a lot of technology that was basically available. And our goals were to create this unified set of tools that, we've sort of highlighted are necessary, right, for today, for tomorrow, et cetera. So one of the first things we did was to unify the infrastructure, right? So everything uses all the same middleware that the rest of, Oracle uses. You can basically do models that use BPEL or BPMN, and it runs on one engine, right? So there's a unified engine at the heart of this. There's a unified repository for metadata. But basically this unified infrastructure is responsible for reducing complexity, right? And, whether you choose Oracle or another vendor, certainly that's your call depending on your needs. But I certainly would advise you to consider the need for unified infrastructure because it just saves time and reduces overhead, right? So this, unified infrastructure then is responsible for all those things you see in red there, integrating with, the rest of the world, if you will, as well as reducing complexity and managing all types of processes. And then we looked at basically tooling, unifying the tools, right? Again, providing tools for every role, tools that enable fast time to value, enable the business to be part of it. And then lastly, unified collaboration, right? Making it easier to connect with others, to be able to do all the work that's required as part of the tasks or interaction that are part of the whole project faster and more efficiently. Okay. So let me wrap up with a few final thoughts and certainly take any questions you may have. Technology has always been a component of BPM. right? And this is the great news, because if BPM was tied to one specific technology, it might as well have green screens and be as difficult to operate as command line systems of 30 years ago. But it has been able to, by the nature of the type of technology it is, to adopt and take advantage of the latest and greatest in technology. And it will. It's one of the great things about BPM, which you can't necessarily say about other types of technology. So don't fear new technology with BPM. There's always a way to embrace it for great benefit. We talked about basically the evolving needs for BPM, what we believe are, what our customers tell us, what we see for really today as well as tomorrow. Right? The need to reduce complexity, the need to unify basically the product to make it simpler and easier to be used by the business as well as IT. Right? The need for faster time to value. Right? Also, the idea of tactical projects versus strategic. In the last section that we'll have today after the demo, we'll give you some examples of that. But I certainly encourage you to look at the use of BPM for tactical, because in addition to providing that great ROI that it often does, it also has a ton of other benefits. Number one, it demonstrates to the business that this stuff has value for them, because you're solving a problem they have, right? And that's critical. So that the next, set of projects you want to manage with BPM, they'll be open to, right? Number two, you're essentially, in the process of rolling this out, rolling out the infrastructure for strategic change in the future, right? And, you're all, I'm sure, familiar with how, business and IT sort of leapfrog back and forth. The business, though, always seems to want more than the capabilities that IT can deliver at any particular time. Well, just imagine if you had the infrastructure for strategic change ahead of when folks really needed it, right? That's a huge jump ahead, basically, in capability when it's required by the business. That's what tactical projects can do for you, okay? And lastly, just tactical projects provide a more measured way of achieving success easily. And when you start down the path of BPM, that's a critical point, basically, right? You want to achieve success so that you can build on it. All right, and lastly, just the point that what we deliver from Oracle, we believe, really helps to break down the barriers we talked about, both in general that there are to BPM, as well as the tools sort of impose on their own. And I believe that our product really enables you to address tactical and strategic projects. Any questions? What do you think? This makes sense? Yeah? How many folks here are looking at managing processes that they would say are tactical projects today? Great. Great. Yeah, it's about half. Good stuff. That's good to see. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. So just, sort of as a closing point here, we talk about our solution as being unified, complete, and social. And those are really the three key points to recall. Unified to remove complexity, complete, and that it enables whatever you need to do today as well as tomorrow, and social so that you can collaborate more effectively to basically achieve success. There's a number of places basically you can be involved in BPM from an Oracle perspective, certainly our website, but I also encourage you to join us in our Twitter feed as well as Facebook, and we certainly have a blog on blogs.oracle.com that lists some latest and greatest product information. Okay. So with that, I thank you for your attention today. I thank you for coming, and I think it's wonderful to hear the trends that are evolving just in this room, all right, and the types of projects you're undertaking, and certainly your self-selected interest in BPM. Thanks.